Tanzania's Ministry of Minerals has confirmed plans to establish a uranium value addition plant in the Ruvuma region in the south of the country.
Now, Tanzania's economy is growing rapidly, projected to expand by 6% this year, driven by significant infrastructure investments.
Our economic goal is to grow the economy from the current 5.6% to more than 7% as we head to 2030. This growth will enable the government to improve social services and create an enabling environment for economic expansion.
While everyone was watching Russia get sanctioned out of Europe, Moscow just signed a $1.2 billion uranium deal with Tanzania that nobody's talking about. Construction starts in the first quarter of 2026 and production begins in 2029. By the time this facility is fully operational, Tanzania will control 300,000 tons of processed uranium over 20 years, which makes them one of the top 10 uranium producers globally. Russia doesn't just get the uranium, they get a foothold on the Indian Ocean, access to a port that handles 90% of East Africa's trade, and a partner that just played the West, China, and Russia against each other and came out with leverage they haven't had in decades. This matters because uranium is about to become the most strategic commodity on the planet. Nuclear energy is back. Countries that spent years shutting down reactors are now building them again because solar and wind cannot power data centers running AI 24/7. Uranium prices have more than doubled since 2020. The US just banned Russian uranium imports until 2040, which means Russia needs new customers and new supply chains that Washington cannot touch. Tanzania just gave them both. And here's the part that should make you pay attention. Tanzania is not some desperate failed state taking whatever deal they can get. They are the fastest growing economy in East Africa, sitting on 150 million tons of uranium ore, and they have been waiting for someone to help them turn that into money. Russia showed up with the technology, the financing, and a model that doesn't come with the strings Western companies attach. Tanzania said yes, and the West is now scrambling to figure out what just happened. Let's set the board here. Tanzania sits on Africa's eastern coast, right on the Indian Ocean, directly across from the Arabian Peninsula and the Middle East. The port of Dar es Salaam is the fourth largest on Africa's Indian Ocean coast, behind only Durban, Mombasa, and Maputo. It handles over 90% of Tanzania's international trade and serves as the gateway for 6 landlocked countries: Zambia, Malawi, Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. When Zambian copper needs to reach global markets, it goes through Dar es Salaam. When fuel heads inland to Central Africa, it comes through Dar es Salaam. This is not some isolated port in a backwater, this is a logistics hub controlling access to resource-rich interior Africa. Tanzania has 65 million people, a GDP growing at around 5% annually, and a government that's been politically stable under President Samia Suluhu Hassan since 2021. They are not aligned with the West, they are not aligned with China, they are playing everyone, and they are exceptionally good at it. Russia's Africa strategy is simple. Go where the West will not, or where the West shows up late with conditions attached. Offer nuclear technology, military training, and resource deals that do not come with lectures about democracy or human rights. Do not ask for regime change, do not impose austerity, just build the thing, split the revenue, and lock in long-term partnerships that give Russia leverage in regions where Western influence is either weak or resented. Rosatom, Russia's state nuclear company, has signed nuclear cooperation agreements with 16 African countries since 2004. Most of those agreements sat dormant for years because financing was hard to secure, and African governments were cautious about Russian technology. That changed after 2022. Sanctions pushed Russia to prioritize non-Western markets. African countries watched the US freeze $300 billion of Russian reserves and realized their own dollar holdings could vanish the same way. Suddenly, Russian deals that looked risky before started looking like diversification. The move everyone missed happened in July 2025. Rosatom subsidiary, Mantra Tanzania, launched a $400 million pilot uranium processing plant at the Mkuju River project in southern Tanzania. President Samia Suluhu Hassan showed up for the ceremony. Rosatom's Director General flew in from Moscow. The facility is not just a pilot project, it is phase 1 of a $1.2 billion deal to build a full-scale processing complex capable of producing 3,000 tons of uranium per year once operational. Construction on the main facility starts in the first quarter of 2026. Commissioning is scheduled for 2029. Over 20 years, They plan to process 300,000 tons of uranium, and Tanzania's government holds a 20% stake, projected to earn $40 million annually in dividends. This is not aid. This is not a loan with strings. This is a joint venture where Tanzania owns part of the asset and gets paid every year it operates. Here's why this deal looked boring to most people but is not. Uranium projects get announced all the time, yet very few actually get built because the upfront capital is massive. The regulatory approval process takes years, and uranium prices are volatile enough that companies go bankrupt waiting for markets to recover. Tanzania's been sitting on the Mkuju River deposit since 2009, when a company called Mantra Resources discovered 150 million tons of uranium ore in the Selous Game Reserve. Various Western companies circled the project for years, but none of them could make the economics work. Environmental groups raised concerns. Financing dried up during uranium's price collapse in the 2010s. The project stalled. Russia's Uranium 1, a Rosatom subsidiary, quietly bought Mantra Resources and sat on the asset, waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 2024, when uranium prices spiked, nuclear energy made a global comeback, and the US decided to ban Russian uranium imports. Suddenly, Tanzania went from a marginal project to a strategic necessity. Russia needed new uranium supply outside Western reach. Tanzania needed someone who could actually build the thing. The deal got done in months. Why this helps Tanzania is straightforward, and it is not the public relations version about clean energy and development. Tanzania gets $40 million a year in dividends once the facility is operational, that is locked in government revenue that does not depend on commodity price swings or export taxes. They get 4,000 direct jobs and 100,000 indirect jobs in a region that has almost no industrial employment. The southern part of Tanzania, where this project sits, has been economically neglected for decades. This changes that overnight. Tanzania becomes one of the top 10 uranium producers globally, which gives them a seat at the table in nuclear energy discussions and makes them relevant to every country trying to secure uranium supply chains. But the real benefit is leverage. For years, Tanzania had to choose between Western investment that came with conditions or Chinese investment that came with debt. Russia offers a third option: joint ventures where Tanzania owns equity, gets dividends, and does not have to restructure their government or borrow at rates they cannot afford. That optionality is worth more than the revenue, because it means Tanzania can now play offers against each other and negotiate from strength instead of desperation. Why this helps Russia is the long game, and it is where the chess metaphor actually fits. Russia's economy is under the most aggressive sanctions regime in modern history. They cannot access Western financial markets. They cannot trade freely in dollars or euros, and their oil and gas exports to Europe have collapsed. But they still have technology, specifically nuclear technology, that much of the world wants and cannot easily get anywhere else. Rosatom is the world's largest nuclear company by reactor construction. They build more reactors internationally than the US, France, and South Korea combined. By locking in uranium supply in Tanzania, Russia secures feedstock for its domestic reactors and for export to countries that aren't sanctioning them, which is most of the world. They get access to Dar es Salaam's port, which gives them a logistics node on the Indian Ocean that can service their growing trade with Asia and the Middle East. And they build a partnership with a country that controls access to resource-rich Central Africa, which means Russian influence doesn't stop at Tanzania's borders. If Zambian copper or Congolese cobalt needs to move through Dar es Salaam, and Russia has a strong relationship with Tanzania, that's leverage over supply chains that power electric vehicles and renewable energy globally. The part that makes the West nervous is not the uranium deal itself, it is the pattern. Russia is now actively involved in nuclear projects across 16 African countries. Ethiopia just received IAEA approval to build a nuclear plant with Rosatom. Namibia signed a $450 million deal for uranium processing infrastructure. And Burkina Faso entered a cooperation framework for radiation technology and training. Each of these deals gives Russia a foothold, a revenue stream, and influence over countries that are either non-aligned or actively distancing themselves from Western institutions. The West spent decades telling African countries to liberalize their economies, accept IMF conditions, and wait for private investment that mostly never came. Russia shows up with state financing, no political conditions, and a willingness to build things that Western companies won't touch because the risk-adjusted returns don't meet their thresholds. African governments notice. They also notice that the US banned Russian uranium but doesn't have a plan to replace it. which means American nuclear plants are still buying Russian uranium under waivers, while lecturing other countries about strategic dependencies. The hypocrisy is obvious, and it's costing the West credibility. This is not isolated. Tanzania is part of a bigger shift, where African countries are diversifying away from exclusive relationships with former colonial powers and the United States. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, signed a 15 billion yuan currency swap with China and has been testing oil sales paid in rupees instead of dollars. Egypt joined BRICS in 2024 and now settles 15 to 20% of trade with China in yuan. Ethiopia signed a $1 billion currency swap with China in 2022 and is using it to bypass dollar shortages. Kenya completed an oil purchase from the UAE paid entirely in Kenyan shillings in 2024, cutting out the dollar conversion that used to drain foreign reserves. The pattern is the same everywhere. Countries with resources that the world needs are realizing they do not have to accept dollar dominance, Western financing terms, or political conditions if they are willing to deal with China, Russia, or Gulf states that offer alternatives. Tanzania's uranium deal fits this pattern perfectly. They had an asset. The West would not develop it on terms Tanzania found acceptable. Russia offered better terms, and Tanzania took the deal. The West is now complaining, but they are not offering a counter-proposal that matches what Russia put on the table. What happens if this continues depends on how the West responds and whether Russia can deliver. If Russia actually builds the facility on schedule, processes uranium profitably, and pays Tanzania the promised dividends, other African countries will line up for similar deals. Rosatom already has agreements with over a dozen nations. Most of them are watching Tanzania to see if the model works. If it does, expect more joint ventures in uranium, nuclear power, and critical minerals across the continent. Russia's share of African energy infrastructure could grow significantly over the next decade, which would give Moscow economic leverage that partially offsets its isolation from Western markets. For Tanzania, the best-case scenario is they become a major uranium exporter, attract more foreign investment because they've proven they can manage large industrial projects, and use the revenue to fund infrastructure and development without taking on unsustainable debt. The risk is that uranium prices crash, the project becomes unprofitable, and Tanzania is stuck with a facility that costs more to operate than it generates in revenue. There's also environmental risk. Uranium mining produces radioactive waste, and if that's not managed properly, it poisons water supplies and displaces communities. Tanzanian civil society groups have raised these concerns. The government and Rosatom have promised international safety standards, but those promises aren't independently verified yet. For the West, the paths forward are all difficult. They could try to outcompete Russia by offering better financing terms for African energy projects, but that requires political will and budgets that most Western governments don't have. They could sanction countries that deal with Russia, but that would push more nations toward China and fracture what's left of Western influence in Africa. Or they could accept that Russia is going to have a significant role in African energy and focus on securing their own supply chains through partnerships with countries that are still Western aligned, like Australia and Canada for uranium. None of these options are great, and the West has been slow to recognize the urgency. The US held its first ever US-Africa Nuclear Energy Summit in May 2024, decades after Russia had already signed agreements with over a dozen countries. The American ambassador to Ghana promised that the US would be Africa's 100-year nuclear energy partner, which is a nice slogan. But Russia is the one actually building reactors and processing plants right now. Slogans don't compete with steel and concrete. The thought that should stick with you is this: power does not move through headlines or announcements, it moves through infrastructure, long-term contracts, and the patient accumulation of leverage that nobody notices until it is too late to reverse. Russia just locked in access to one of Africa's largest uranium deposits, a strategic port on the Indian Ocean, and a partnership with a country that controls logistics for half of Central Africa. They did it while the West was distracted, and they did it on terms that make Tanzania a stakeholder in Russia's success, instead of a client dependent on Russian goodwill. That is not aggression, that is strategic positioning. And the countries that understand how to build these partnerships without demanding ideological alignment are the ones reshaping the global order, while everyone else argues about democracy and rules-based international systems. Tanzania did not choose Russia because they love Moscow, they chose Russia because Russia showed up with a deal that worked for Tanzania's interests. If the West wants to compete, they need to start showing up with deals that do the same.